So quick like overview of O2O, just to make sure we all are on the same page, just to refresh our understanding. So you know O2O is Motion Authorization Framework for Delegated Access Control. It introduces multiple grant types. A grant type defines how you can get an access token from an authorization server to access a resource on behalf of the resource owner. The most popular grant type is authorization code grant type. If you look at most of the implementations, I guess more than 90% of implementations, they are using authorization code grant type, irrespective of the application, whether it's a web application, a single page application, native mobile app, all of them are using authorization code grant type. To give a quick overview of how it works, so if you go through this sequence diagram, you can see, so you have the browser, then the client application, then the authorization server. So from the browser, you initiate a GET, like maybe you click on login or import photos, then the client will redirect you to the authorization server to 302, and in the request 302, you will see the client ID. It's an identifier for the authorization server to identify the client. And also you set response type as code. So if you are using authorization code, you must set response type as code. And you also know that from the last session, with the response type, we also associate something called response mode. It's not defined in the OSPEC, but for a given response type, there's an associated response mode too. For the response type code, the associated response mode by default is query. Right? So that means you get the authorization code as a as a query parameter. Yeah. Then you send a GET request to the authorization server. Authorization server will check whether there's a valid session for the user. If not, it will prompt the user to authenticate. Once the authentication is done, authorization server will generate a code, which is the authorization code, and will send it as a query parameter to the client. It goes to the browser. It's a 302. Then the client will do a post to the authorization server with the code it got from the previous step, and also optionally the client can authenticate to the authorization server as well. Either you can use client ID and client secret, or else you can use strong authentication option like mutual TLS, and there are other options as well. For example, JWT client authentication, some other client authentication likewise. Somehow you can authenticate the client to the authorization server. It's optional. You don't need to necessarily authenticate the client even in the authorization code grant type. Now you get the access token. Now the client can use access token to access protected resources. This is a high level overview of authorization code. And this is a different view of the same sequence diagram. By step 5, so that's the access token you got from the authorization server to the auth client. At this point, the client doesn't know anything about the resource owner, right? It simply has an access token, which is an arbitrary string, right? It doesn't necessarily include the information about the resource owner. So there's no authentication there, right? Then the client can still use that access token to access a resource in the resource server. It can be an API on behalf of the user, even without knowing who the user is, right? Then you pass that access token. That's the delegated authorization part, right? The client accessing a resource on behalf of the resource owner, but the client doesn't need to know who the user is. Now the token comes to the resource server. Resource server gets the access token. Now, based on the type of the access token, like if it is self-contained or a reference token. So if it's reference token, the resource server can talk to the issue and find out the metadata related to that particular token, and then figure out who the client is, who the user is. So that includes sort of an authentication part at the resource server. Resource server will identify who the client and who the end user is, or the resource owner is. Then after that, a resource server can do access control check, see whether this token is good enough to access this particular resource, or else it can find out the scopes associated with that token and see whether you have the enough scopes to access this resource. So that's the authorization part. And if you look at the client point of view, still client does not know who the user is. But over the time, you probably have seen people follow workarounds to use OAuth at the client application side as an authentication protocol too. For example, so there are multiple applications using Facebook login, right? So you go to application, you click on login with Facebook, and now the application knows who the user is. But Facebook doesn't support OpenID Connect. Facebook only supports OAuth2. Then, like, so we just told you that Facebook is about the OAuth is about authorization. Then how come these client applications get to know about the user? So they follow a workaround. So what happens is, even with Facebook login, at the end of step 5, the client application gets an access token from Facebook. Right? It doesn't say anything about the end user. Then after that, the client application uses that access token to access a business API in Facebook. It's not a standard OAuth OpenID Connect API, it's a business API in Facebook, that is graph.facebook.com/me, and you pass the access token, right? Then Facebook will validate the access token and return back the data or the profile information related to the owner of this particular access token. Then the client application can know who the user is. Okay? So this is a workaround around OAuth2O to identify who the user is. Then again, since there's no standard here, if you use OAuth2O for authentication, then you may need to check the specification of each and every IDP to see like how to get the user information from their custom or their proprietary endpoint, right? What OpenID Connect does is it builds an identity layer on top of OAuth2. It simply uses OAuth2 as underneath protocol, and on top of that, it adds additional attributes both in request and response flows. Right? So what you get is, in addition to the access token, you will also get an ID token from the OpenID Connect provider or the authorization server, which includes the set of claims about the user. So the client application can identify the user in addition to getting an access token. Right? So we'll dig into OpenID Connect in detail. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them on chat or just unmute and speak up. Okay. So in OpenID Connect, it defines set of authentication flows. If you are familiar with OAuth2O, you know OAuth defines set of grant types. Right? So a grant type defines how the OAuth client can get an access token from the authorization server. The authorization flow, authentication flows in OpenID Connect use these grant types, some of these grant types, but define its own protocol to how to get an ID token from the authorization server or the OpenID provider, right? So you define that in 3 flows. We'll go through each and every flow and see how those work. So this is how the authorization code flow works. And if you look at this one, you will see this is very much similar to authorization code grant type in OAuth2O, and some, because of the like, these are quite similar to each other, people also misunderstand this authorization code flow is authorization code grant type. Implicit flow is the implicit grant type. It is not. Authorization code and flow and all the other flows in OpenID Connect, it adds a lot of value to the grant types that are defined in OAuth2O. So let's see how the authorization code flow works. So this is a client application, and don't think that about the single page apps yet. So think about this is just a web app, right? So we'll talk about SPS later. So you have a web app. So this user wants to authenticate, and the client application will redirect the user through the browser user agent to the web browser to the authorization server's authorized endpoint. That's number 1. Then authorization server will find out this user doesn't have a session and will redirect user again or send a 200 response back to get the user's credentials, right? And if you look at the number 1 arrow, the request generated from the client to the authorized endpoint, it includes some parameters. So one critical parameter is scope. If you use OpenID, any of the OpenID Connect flows, you must set scope value to OpenID. It's a must, right? The value of response type, it changes by different authentication flows. If you use authentication code flow, then you must use code as a response type, right? It's a must. So then again, we discussed before, a response type defines what tokens you expect from the authorized endpoint. So if you said response type is code, then the authorized endpoint in number 5 should return an authorization code, right? Then the authorization server, the authorized endpoint, can return this code in multiple ways. You can send that in a query parameter, you can send this as a URL fragment, or else you can send this as a HTML form post, right? So these are the common ones. So how do you want to get this code back is defined under the response mode parameter, right? If you use response type as code, then the default response mode is query. So that means you get this authorization code in the response to the redirect URI as a query parameter, right? So you get this query parameter, the client, then the client in step 6 will exchange this code to an access token, refresh token, and ID token, right? So in addition to the OAuth2 authorization code grant type, you get an ID token, right? In the step 6, optionally, the client can authenticate to the authorization server, right? So this is how the authorization code flow works. So we'll dig into detail as we go on, like how you fix some security issues, those stuff later on. Fine. Yeah, so okay, so we'll discuss security issues as we go on. This is a sequence diagram of the authorization code flow, the same thing, right? You can see how the exact interactions happen between these 3 entities, the browser, client, and the authorization server. This is the implicit flow. So I'll go through the implicit flow first, and then try to explain some of the security issues and how the implicit flow differs from the implicit grant type defining OAuth2. Right? So you have the client application. You click on login, then client application will redirect you through the web browser to the user agent to the authorized endpoint of the authorization server. And if you look at that request, number 1 arrow, once again, for any authentication flow is in OpenID Connect, you must use OpenID as the scope, right? Then you have 2 options for the response type. Either you can use ID token, or else you can use ID token and token both, right? You at a given time you should only pick one, either ID token or ID token and token, right? So we know what response type means. So if we said ID token and token, then the authorized endpoint of the OpenID Connect server should return back ID token and token. Then again, there should be a response mode associated with this particular response type. For both the response type, the default response mode is fragment. That means authorization server should return back these tokens as URI fragment. So ID token should be a URI fragment as well, and token, ID token, both are URI fragments. Right? So both will come to the client application. Then client can look at the ID token and identify who the user is. Then client can use the access token to access the upstream APIs. Right? So this is how the implicit flow works. Now, if you go through the same implicit grant type inherits certain security issues. Right? One key issue is token injection. So let's see how token injection works with implicit grant type and see how OpenID Connect fixes that. Right? So token injection means the attacker somehow get access to the client application and find a legitimate legal access token, right? So basically you get some access token out of the client application. Now you try to inject this access token, right, to the client application and try to log into the client application as the owner of the access token. Right? So it's very straightforward. You have the access token. Then if you look at number 5, right? So this is this same set of tokens to the to an endpoint in client application. What you can do is you know the endpoint, then you can just put the token that you got from the client application or the stolen token or the leaked token here, and you send that to the client application. Now what would happen, right? So now it goes to the client application. It's a legitimate access token issued for that particular client application. So the client application will log you in, right? So then you can log in as a user, or else you can impersonate another user by stealing a legitimate access token, right? So can state parameter in OAuth2O fix this, right? So state parameter is an optional parameter in implicit grant type. You don't need to use state parameter, but it's recommended to use. So let's see how state parameter works. So the way state parameter works is, before you generate this request, the client application will generate some random value, right, and put that in a state. So then that state attribute will also go in number one arrow to the authorization server. At the same time, the client application will also inject that state value to the browser session, right? Now, authorization server will do all the authentication and respond back with the token to the client application, no ID token. So we are talking about the implicit grant type, no ID token, just a token as a URL fragment to the client application. Now, if you pass state parameter, authorization server must return back the same state parameter to the client application. So that means in addition to the token, you will also see the state parameter. Then the client has to extract out the state parameter from the response it get from the authorization server and validate that against what is stored in the session. If they do match, then it's fine. Otherwise, you need to reject the request. But this doesn't solve the token injection problem. It will solve the cross-site request forgery attacks. So why this doesn't solve? Let's once again go to an example. Now, if I want to execute this attack, so what I will do is I have the stolen token with me, but I'll keep it with me and I'll generate a login flow with the client ID. Right? Then the client will store the generated state in my browser session. And since the state value goes in the request, I know what the state value is. I copy that state value, which is generated for my browser session, and I send the stolen token and my state value in this request. Then it will pass, right, from the client side validation, because whatever the state value comes in that request is also in my browser session. So once again, I can impersonate the user and log in with the stolen access token. So implicit grant type doesn't fix that problem because the tokens are not bound to a user session. Right? In OpenID Connect, you can fix that. Right? If you use implicit flow in OpenID Connect, you must use a value call, attribute call nonce. Right? So in this request, client has to generate a value call nonce and send it along with the request to number one. Then if the authorization server sees a value in nonce attribute, authorization server must include the nonce value to the ID token it generates, right? So now the nonce value generated from the client is in the ID token. And also just like the state parameter, the client should add that nonce value to the browser session, right? So now the ID token has the nonce value the client generated and it is signed. In addition to that, if you have an access token in the response, OpenID Connect implicit flow says, you also must generate or derive a hash from the access token. It's called AT hash. How you derive the hash is mentioned in the spec, and put that AT hash value in the ID token. So now the ID token has an AT hash value and also the nonce value, and it goes to the client application. Now client application can validate the signature of JWT and look at the client ID, and it knows this is a token coming to me and it is signed properly, it's a legitimate token. Then it will look at the nonce value, and nonce value in the token matches with what's in session. So it's a ID token which is bound to that particular user's browser session. That also passes. Then it will calculate the hash of the access token and then see whether that's the value in the AT hash of the ID token. Then it's fine. Then you can let the user access the application. Right? So basically what happens is you bind the access token to the ID token, then bind the ID token to the browser session. So that means you bind the access token to the browser session. Now, if I try to inject my access token, it won't pass, right? Any questions on that?
Yes. Yes, I heard like you're binding them and everything is there in session. So why did not pass in the second case? I
Yeah,
missed that.
second case. Okay, the reason is, okay, so let's say now you have the access token, right? So I steal your access token, right?
Yes. Yes.
Now let's say I somehow from here I get the access token,
Hmm.
right? Then I don't know your nonce value, right? I
So
don't.
nonce value is in browser
Yeah,
session.
so I know the nonce value in my browser, right?
Yes.
I don't know the original nonce value associated with this particular token at that time this token was issued to, right? Now, if
Okay.
I try to replay both ID token and access token, right, then ID token has a nonce value too. It is signed, right? But I might have stolen the ID token too. But that's not the value in my browser session.
Hmm. Okay. So there is something nonce value which is in the client application and which is not in the browser.
Something in the ID token, right? So when you initially generate this request in legitimate manner, ID
Mhm.
token will have the victim's browser's nonce value, right? And it is signed. Now the attacker steals this ID token and token both. Now the ID token has the victim's browser's session value. But when the request is generated from the client application, my browser nonce value is different from what is in the ID token,
Okay.
right?
Okay. Thank you.
So that's how you can prevent it. Any other questions? Okay. And this is how implicit flow works. The same thing, but in a sequence diagram. So one important thing here is in a single page app, what happens is you get the ID token here and the token to Java to the browser. Then it will go. It will send a get to the client app to the web server. Then web server will respond back to the 200, which is a JavaScript which can extract the token from the URL fragment and then execute the OAuth to backend APIs, which are protected with OAuth 2. Okay, I think we discussed this stuff, like what are the difference between the implicit flow and implicit grant type. So implicit grant type itself is not recommended to use, but if it's fine to use implicit flow in OpenID Connect with the method provided by the OpenID Connect itself. So you can get the token injection prevention with the nonce value. Yeah, so this is the OAuth working group recommendation even. So you should not be using any of the like even any token which comes to URL fragment if the tokens are not sender constrained. But if you're using OpenID Connect, the OpenID Connect makes these tokens sender constrained. Okay. So now in authentication code flow, you only get the code from the authorized endpoint. In the implicit flow, you get the ID token or else ID token plus token. Hybrid flow talks about how you can do multiple combinations of these tokens from the authorized endpoint of the OpenID Connect server, right? So in number one, you generate the request and it has a response type called code ID token, right? This is one example. Hybrid flow can have multiple such combinations. If it is code ID token, once again, corresponding response mode is fragment, right? So that means authorization server returns both the code and ID token in as a URL fragment, right? Then it goes to the client application. Client application can exchange the code to a refresh token and access token and also another ID token, right? So this ID token mostly look the same, what you get as a URL fragment and what you get from the token endpoint. Just like in implicit flow, here also you need to use nonce, right? So nonce value should be in the arrow 1, request coming from the client to the authorization server, and also the client application, the authorization server should add that nonce value to the ID token it generates. In addition to the nonce value, just like in the previous case, since we have code in the response, you also need to derive a hash from the code and add that hash value to the ID token as C hash under the C hash attribute, right? So that will prevent code injection attacks in the same way how we explained that with the implicit flow, right? So that means we bind code to the ID token, we bind ID token to the user session, so indirectly we bind code to the user's browser session, right? And also it's recommended, like if you're using code flow, you can also use the PXE profile, proof key for code exchange, that will add more prevention for code interception attacks. The other one is hybrid flow. The other pattern is code token. Now here in the request, response type is set to code token, and the default response mode for code token is fragment, right? So you get the access token and code both in the response, right? As a URL fragment, then you can exchange this code to an ID token and a refresh token. And the other one is you can also ask code, ID token, and token, all three. Right? So in that case, a response type is code, ID token, token. Response mode still a fragment. You will get code, ID token, access token, all in the response. And you can exchange the code to an access token, refresh token, and another token as well. So this is how the hybrid flow works. Now in OpenID Connect, so there are two main ways of requesting attributes. One way is through scope parameter. Right? So OpenID Connect itself defines 20 standard claims, and they group those claims into 4 categories under 4 different scopes. That means if you look at profile, so profile scope value, string value, it is associated with set of other attributes. Same for email, address, phone, like that. So if you want these attributes from the authorized endpoint in the ID token, you can send the scope value to the authorized endpoint, and these claims are known as voluntary claims. So this will be added into ID token, and also you can get this in the user info endpoint as well. Right? Then in addition to that, you can also use a parameter called claims in the authorized request itself. In the request, the initial request from the client application, you can include attribute called claims, and in that claims attribute you can specify the JSON payload, what attributes you expect, individual attributes you expect from to be included in the ID token itself, or else what attributes you expect from an user info endpoint, right? So we didn't discuss user info still. So OpenID Connect has 2 ways of returning attributes. So one is to the ID token, one is to the user info endpoint, and this particular user info endpoint is also protected with OAuth 2. You can access the user info endpoint with the access token you get in the OpenID Connect flow and get the required attributes, right? So let me show you how these scope values are defined. Once again, if you want to add, in addition to these scopes, you can do that too. And also we see some implementations, they have the flexibility to define what should be in this profile, email, address, and phone scope values. Like you can extend what is defined in OAuth spec. So if you look at how we have defined this in WSO2 Identity Server, you can try this out too. This is all open source. If you go to scope definitions here, and if you expand the profile scope, so these are the standard claims defined in OpenID Connect. But if you want to add anything in addition to this, we can do that. It's implementation specific. Then this will be bound to the profile scope, right? Same for the email. We got this one. So this has 2 claims associated with the email, right? And if you want, you can add additional claims as well. Okay, so we already discussed this one, how to return these claims either through the ID token or else through the user info response. Okay, now let's get into single page application and see how we can use OpenID Connect to secure single page apps. So here, so I'm not going to detail on like SP architecture. This is a typical way how you design a single page app. So you have browser. So browser will browser will talk to a web server and load like JavaScript and HTML for the first time. After that, you won't see any page loads. You have the initial HTML with all the JS and CSS. Then from there onwards, from the browser without page reloads, you will talk to the external APIs and get the data and render the UI. Right? So this is a typical, the way a typical single page app works. Now, okay. So then there's a question, right? What does it mean by logging to single page app? Right? Single page app is a public client, right? So that means it's totally under the control of the end user, right? So browser may enforce certain restrictions, but once again, browser is under my control, right? So if I want to spoof anything, I can do that. Like I can write my own browser plugins and do anything to my browser, right? So I can intercept any request going out from my browser, right? Writing different browser plugins. So I have total control over what's happening on the browser. So what does it mean then by logging to a single page app, right? So single page app, it's a dumb app, right? It actually doesn't mean that much like you are logging to single page app. What does mean is how we authenticate from the single page app to the backend APIs, right? So the single page app in the browser can display anything as your username, any other stuff, but that doesn't make sense. You need to make sure all the APIs that are invoked from the web server, web browser, or the SPA, single page app, are properly secure. Right? So you can enforce access control at the SPA, at the browser, but that doesn't make sense. It's just a way like you can build a better UX experience for the user. But still, you need to make sure you do all the authentication and authorization checks at the API server, right? Now, let's see a typical flow, right? So we'll expand this as we move on. How you can log into a single page app using OpenID Connect. So the same thing, right? Same flow. I'm using the authentication code flow here. You get the code. Now, once you get the code, so it sends the browser will send a 302 to the callback URL. This can be endpoint in your web server, right? You don't do any processing. There's no server-side processing. It will simply send back a JavaScript to the browser in 200. Then the authorization code is in a query parameter, right? This JavaScript knows how to extract the authorization code from the query parameter. It will extract that and send a request to the authorization server's token endpoint, and it will pass the code client key. So it's a typo. You don't need to pass client secret. Yes, no point of putting a client secret to a public client because it's all visible to the end users. And exchange the authorization code to an access token and refresh token. And now you have the access token and refresh token and ID token in the browser. Now, so how you store these tokens, we'll discuss later. But if you look at the ID token and if you verify the ID token, you can identify who the user is, right? But that doesn't make any change, right? Like, so you render the UI based on the user and probably user's role, but that doesn't give any additional privilege to the user, right? Even you spoof what is in the ID token, it doesn't make sense. What matters is this access token. Then the browser will use this access token to invoke the APIs on behalf of the user, right? So you need to be careful how you protect the resource server with the access token being used by the browser or the SPA. Okay, so now let's see what are the options to store these tokens. Now you get these tokens to the browser. Now how do you store these tokens? The most popular way we see is use a session storage. So this is HTML5 session storage. Now using session storage, the lifetime of the tokens would be just for that particular tab. So if you close a tab, then it will clean up everything that you store in the session storage under that particular domain. Right? And also session storage is not shared between browser tabs. So it's a much better option. But if your single page application is susceptible to cross-site scripting attacks, so if someone else can run some JavaScript in your single page app, that JavaScript has access to the session storage. So they can get the token from the session storage and send it to somewhere else. Then those the endpoints can use these tokens. That means if you use session storage to store your tokens, you should use another way to protect your application from cross-site scripting. Right? So we'll discuss a way for that. The other alternative to session storage is to use local storage, but it's not once again recommended. It will persist the tokens forever. Even you close the browser, the tokens will remain in the local storage. The best and the most secure way is to use browser's in-memory storage. Right? So how do you do that is from your JavaScript, you can start a worker thread in your browser. So basically using the Web Workers API. Then it will run a given JavaScript in this worker thread. Right? So the worker thread runs in a different space than your JavaScript. So any of these other JavaScripts other than the one that spawn the worker thread won't have access to anything inside that. Right? So it's only your JavaScript which spawn this thread will have access to the what is going on in that thread. So that JavaScript can do the authentication flow and also handle tokens. So that's the best way that you can implement or secure, restore the access tokens, ID tokens, and the refresh tokens. And then again, if you use browser in-memory storage, there is no persistence across page refreshers and browser tabs. Okay, so before that, let me show you a demo and how we have implemented the security for our single page app. If you look at Identity Server, we also, since 5.10 release, we added a user portal that is for the end user. It's a self-care portal. Then we secure that with OpenID Connect, which is this app is a single page app. So if you go to service providers here, this is the user portal application, and it is using OpenID Connect. Okay. So the client ID is user portal, and here we have enabled authentication code and refresh token grant types. So it is using authentication code flow, right? And we have made PXE mandatory, so protect this application from any code interception attacks. And also we have renewal refresh tokens. I'll talk about that later. I have a slide on that towards the end. And also we have implemented token binding, a cookie token binding. So that means this token is bound to the bound to a cookie, right? So I'll explain that too. So let's see how this works. So this is the endpoint. And before that, I'll enable the developer tools. Now, if you look at the network tab, you can see the authorization request generated from the single page app. So here you can see response type is set to code, and the client ID is there. We set of scope values. We set of scope values, and OpenID is a must there. To the redirect URL pointing to the single page app itself. And we are using code challenge method and code challenge. This is these are the parameters required by the PXE specification. Okay, so now let me try login. Now this generates a code, the authorization server generates a code and sends it to the redirect URI. So if you look at that here, right, this is the authorization code which goes in as a query parameter, right? Yeah. So session state is related to the logout. So we are not going to talk about that today. Okay. So now, in addition to this code, the authorization server writes another cookie, right? This cookie should be in the response, right? Call ATBV, right? So this cookie to bind the access token is cookie, right? So now with the code response itself, this token is bound to the authorization server's domain, right? one limitation here, or else the way our application works, you run the user portal under the same domain or a subdomain of the authorization server, right? So that means, right, all the APIs of the authorization server, all the APIs accessed by the user portal, they are under the same domain of the authorization server, right? So if you look at this one, sorry, if you look at this diagram, you will see that, right? In this diagram, right? So this is the authorization server, this is a resource server, right? So all our APIs are running, APIs accessed by the user portal are running under the same domain of the authorization server, or else they have the same root domain. So when the authorization server issues that cookie, it's an HTTP only cookie written to the parent domain. So that means any request generated from the browser to the resource server will also carry that particular cookie. Right? Now you have the cookie. Now if you look at the token request here, right, this is going to the token request, token endpoint of the authorization server. So here we are sending the code, the grant type is authorization code and redirect URI, and the code verifier is required to be complied with PXE. So the authorization server will do the PXE validation and respond back with an access token. So this is access token, right? Now, if you look at the application session storage, so you will see the access token. So we here use session storage because we implement the CRS, the excessive protection with cookies, right? So now, if let's assume you run some JavaScript in our application you support, right? So now this JavaScript has access to the session storage, then it can figure out what the access token is. Now, if you send this access token to somewhere endpoint, at the point the attacker tries to use this access token against any of our APIs, that won't work because that doesn't have the cookie, right? But here we have the cookie, and whenever we invoke an API, so if you go back to the network tab, so this is an API to get the user's applications. If you look at the headers, right? So we are sending the authorization header, the access token, and if you look at the cookie, we are also sending this cookie. Right? This is the cookie which is bound to this particular access token. Then when this cookie goes to the authorization server, or when it goes to the resource server, and when resource server talks to the authorization server to validate the token, authorization server will check whether it's a valid token, and also this carries the associated cookie. If not, it will reject the request, right? So that is how we protect the user portal from cross-site scripting attack, right? So basically, you can call it a split token approach. We don't send the complete access token either in the cookie or in the session storage, right? So if you don't store it in session storage but store it in cookie, then you cannot make these cookies HTTP only, because your JavaScript running on this single page app needs to access the cookie to get the access token. So that means any other JavaScript can access a cookie too, right? But the limitation in this approach is both your resource server and authorization server runs under the same parent domain. So that's why they can share the cookies. Yeah. So then, like, so when you want to invoke multiple APIs from different domains, browser won't let you do that default, right? Browser check whether the requests are generated from the same origin. But if the single page app wants to invoke multiple APIs, then you need to enable CORS at those APIs. The typical approach which is, rather than enabling CORS at each API, right? Enabling CORS for your single page app domain, you will have an API gateway. So all the business APIs you want to invoke from the your application are fronted by the gateway, and at the gateway you enable CORS, right? So then you don't need to worry about each and individual APIs, right? So with that approach, like, you can make sure your Spark can call any external API. Okay. So then, how do you build an authorization model for single page application using scopes? So once again, as we discussed before, single page app itself is a dumb application, right? So whatever we do at the browser level based on the authorization, it's just to render the application nicely. You need to make sure you have the proper authorization model applied at the gateway before your APIs, right? So one approach is here, like you can request, you can identify all the scopes your application needs to invoke the upstream APIs from the Spark. Then when you generate the request to the authorized endpoint to get the access token and ID token, you can pass that scope parameters, and then you get an access token. You may not get the access token associated with all the scopes you requested. So authorization server can do an authorization check to see whether what scopes this user is eligible, and with the access token alone, you will get the granted scopes, right? Then you can look at that scopes you get from the authorization server, and based on that, you can render the UI. Then again, since you need to, rather than passing multiple scopes in a request, what you can do is you can group those scopes together. It has to be an agreement with the Spark single page app and the authorization server. So you just send some grouped scope value. Then authorization server knows how to interpret that, and it knows what are the subscopes associated with that one, and get the permission from the user, and will return back the subscopes associated with the token to the client application, and based on that, you can render the UI. One issue here is, so when you ask one token from multiple set of scopes, so this token itself is overscoped, right? So if someone steals this token, the impact is high. At the same time, since your single page app works with multiple endpoints, so these endpoints can come from different trust domain, but still all of them would trust your authorization server. Then if you send a token to a one endpoint which has scopes that is not required for that particular endpoint, then that token can be reused or replayed to access another endpoint. So there's a security issue. So what you can do is, rather than getting an overscoped single access token, you can get multiple access tokens with a narrow down scope, right? So this is something we are planning to implement at WSO2, right? It's a custom grantor we are planning to build. So when you request access token, you will get multiple access tokens with narrow down scopes in the same response from the authorization server. Then you can use different access tokens based on which API you talk to. This adds some overhead to your client application, but using JavaScript client library, you can minimize that overhead. Right? Yeah. So there's a question. Do you have to send the cookie value to the introspection endpoint in the example you gave? Yes. So in a typical scenario, yes. But in the identity server use case in our product, you don't need to send an introspection endpoint, because authorization server itself hosts that APIs. So the same endpoint, right? But if you want to decouple that, yes. So then you need to send the cookie value to the introspection endpoint. But our case, we don't need to do that, because it's the same server which is hosting these APIs and also issuing the token. Right. Then some of the attack vectors. So we already discussed the first one, right? That we'll see how to address other stuff. So this we discussed already, and you must use Pixel to prevent code interception attacks. And authorization server metadata spoofing. So here, the way it happens is you get the token to the browser, then browser may call the user info endpoint of the authorization server, right, passing the access token it got from the previous response. Now, if someone changes the metadata of the authorization server, you may change the user info endpoint in the metadata of the authorization server, which can point to an endpoint of the attacker. Okay. So in that case, attacker will get hold of the access token, then the attacker should be able to use that. Right? If the token is not bound to user session. So we'll talk about how to fix that too. Then or else the resource server can be compromised. This is straightforward. So you pass this access token here, this resource server can be compromised, then the attackers can get hold of your tokens. So how to prevent that? So this is a new specification coming under OAuth working group called DPOP, or demonstration of proof of possession token. So I'll give a very high level overview of how this works. what is in green box is the same, right? You get the authorization code. Then the browser will extract out the authorization code from the query parameter. Then in a typical way, you do a post to the token endpoint of the authorization server, right? Here we just send the client ID. But if you follow the depop spec, then you need to attach a depop token or demonstration of proof of possession token, which is in fact a JWT, right? So that means that the browser, you generate keys and you generate a JWT, you sign it, and you send that token to the authorization server with your public key, right? Then the authorization server will validate the signature. So validated signature means what is embedded in the public key is owned by the sender, right? Then it issues an access token and refresh token bound to this particular public key, right? To send that to the browser, right? Then when the and also in the response, in a typical OAuth flow, what you get as token type is bearer. So in this case, you have to set the token type to depop. Then when the browser wants to invoke an API, right, in the resource server, it also has to include this depop token. You have to generate another depop token with the same keys you generated in the first place, right? You generate a new JWT, and that JWT should include the HTTP method and the URL corresponding to resource server, right? Endpoint corresponding to resource server should not have any query parameters, so URL fragment, and you send that JWT, the depop proof, and also the depop, the access token that you got from the authorization server, and send it to the resource server. Our resource server first will validate the proof of possession token, validate its signature, right? And also it will check whether its own endpoints are in the JWT claim set. If all looks good, so it's a valid proof token, but you still don't know it's the same token which is associated with access token, right? So there are multiple ways how you can pass. Basically, the public, you need to see whether public key that you use to validate the depop token is the one associated with the token, right? There are two ways to do that. Either you can embed the public key to the access token itself when the authorization server generates that, or else introspection endpoint, when you introspect the token, can return back the public key. So then the resource server can do the validation, right? So in that case, if this is an attacker's resource server, right? If with authorization server metadata spoofing, you get this token. But if this tries to use this token to access a valid resource, then it will fail, because resource server doesn't know how to generate a valid depop token. And if it tries to reuse the depop token it won't work, because the endpoint there is different, right? The HTTP method and the URL, it's not the same in what you got from the client in the first place. So it will fail, right? So this is a very good way of protecting this type of attacks, right? If you heard of the TLS token binding, so TLS token binding is much stronger than this, but TLS token binding will work. It has to be supported on browser. But the way depop spec was designed, you don't need to get a first-class support from browser. From the application developers itself, they can implement the end-to-end flow. Then token leakage in referrer header, right? So if you put anything in the query parameter, like if you get the authorization code in the query parameter, then it can go in a referrer header to external links, right? So basically your authorization code can get leaked. So to avoid that, you can use a referrer header policy to say no referrer. So then the code won't go. And even if you use PXE, even the token get leaked, they won't be able to use it, right? Because it's protected with PXE. The code, whoever gets the authorization code will not know the code verifier to exchange that to an access token. Then if you are using URL fragments by the spec itself, the browser should not include any URL fragments in the referrer header. But if you look at the past, some browsers, Chrome, long time back, it included the URL fragment in the referrer header, right? But by spec, if the browser is compliant with spec, it should not send URL fragments as the referrer header. The other, the challenging part is unintended token usage. So that means you are the legitimate user, right? You log into a single page app, then you have access to all the tokens, right? So you can take a token out, and instead of invoking APIs from the single page app, you can write a curl client and invoke it, right? Or else you can build your own client application, right? So that's challenging to fix. But if you use TLS token binding, it'll fix that to some extent, because in TLS token binding, your token is bound to the TLS channel itself. So you cannot export it and use it somewhere else, right? But so there are some prevention mechanisms. One is you need to enforce throttling per user per app at your gateway level. So that means if I steal my token and if I create my own app, I just eating out my own quota, right? But if you do the throttling policies per app only, then if I steal that token, I won't expect a high traffic pattern from my single page app. But if I steal this token and create my own app, that will generate more traffic, more load, and it will eat out the quota of all the users of that particular application. So it's always better to have per user per app policy, right? So one good example would be like, so we work with one customer in US. So they have a mobile app, and it's basically you can order tickets or sell tickets for movies using that particular application. Now there's an access token embedded to that particular application. You should be able to just go to this application and then invoke APIs anonymously. So those anonymous APIs also secured with OAuth. So we embedded a token to the application itself, right? So you invoke those APIs, and then you get the movie list, those stuff. Whenever you want to buy a ticket only, you need to log in, right? But even for the anonymous users, we protect the APIs from OAuth. The company will generate revenue from ads, right? Now, if I'm a legitimate user and if I get an access token, if I steal that access token and create a new application, right, which can access same set of APIs, then you are going to lose a revenue, right? So other people will also go to that particular application and do the same things, invoking your API, right? So that is why we should try to protect your application from unintended usage, even the APIs are invoked from a legitimate user. Okay, so this is the last slide. So how you handle refresh tokens, right? So ideally, so you need to decide like how long you need to have a refresh token. In single page app, one best practice would be like you will have like longer refresh time. So maybe let's say 24 hours, but you will break down that into multiple rotational access tokens, refresh tokens, right? So that means you have a lengthier time, but there's the expiration for the rotational token. So every 10 seconds you need to renew, right? But you can only renew up to 24 hours. So what's the benefit here? So if you lose a refresh token, when the legitimate app refreshes a token, you will invalidate the previous token. And also, if someone tries to use that refresh token outside the access token, outside your application, right, to refresh and get a new access token, then when you try to renew your old token, then the authorization server will detect that your refresh token is being leaked. Then it will invalidate all the refresh tokens. So the legitimate app also initiate the login again. So it provides more better protection against your refresh token. Yeah, so that's what I plan to cover in this session. If you have any questions, we can discuss them now. You can unmute and speak up, or else just type on the Zoom chat.
Prabhat, are you going to be sharing the recording of this?
Yeah, yes, we'll share the recording, yeah.
And is it what you mentioned now, is there in the Microsoft Service Security book also, or something different is there in that?
Not all of them are. So another book in Advanced API Security, it has some of the patterns, but not all of them are there.
Are you going to give us the YouTube link for
yes.
so we can subscribe?
We'll share the recording, yeah. So if you go to vlog.facilelogin.com, so that's the YouTube channel. So this will be posted there, and all the other videos that we did in last 3 meetups, they are posted there too.
Can you repeat it? It's called Vlog.
Vlog, I'll type this. It's vlog, vlog.facilelogin.com.
Okay, thank you, sir. And then the PowerPoint will be posted in YouTube, or
Yeah, we'll share that too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you,
And
sir.
next meetup, we are going to talk about single logout. So we'll see like how OpenID Connect and SAML using single logout, and single logout has like multiple challenges too. So we'll try to explore those stuff.
Cool.
Okay,
Sorry,
then, yeah.
I
Any
get
questions?
yeah, I think my connection got lost. I got adjusted back. Yeah, is there any place where like I can just go and learn this one like step by step? That's what I'm just trying to see, like in any of particular book of yours or anywhere.
Yeah, I don't single
Exam.
place. But one thing you can look at is if you go to the OAuth IETF working group, it has a place which lists out all the RFCs and draft specifications. There you can find like different patterns and how people thinking about this security stuff. And there's no single place like, so if you look at OAuth2 fundamental, it covers in my book, and also there's another one, Justin Risher has written a book on OAuth2 in action. Yeah, but it doesn't discuss this stuff to this level. You need to go through different specs too.
Okay, so is
But
there
you
any
can, so
other
we have
place?
a Slack channel, IAM for Dev Slack channel. If you go to the meetup link, it has an invitation to join Slack channel. If you join that, then we can discuss anything there. Yeah.
Okay, is there anything like online available, like the site whatever you showed, like all these different versions like deployed anywhere like that? Like, okay, you just send the request and you will see how it come back, so that we know how the transaction will go
Yeah,
physically.
there are different like playgrounds, like OAuth playgrounds. In Google has its own playground. So there are multiple apps. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, if there is anything that you know of, like Google Playground, you told if you have a link for it,
Sure.
I'll try to Google it. If I'm sure you should be able to get it, but just in case, if you can just
Sure.
put it
Yeah.
in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the
Okay.
session.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining, and stay safe. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. How the heck? Where do I?